The conquered academy of the bright verge sat on a moon that had never known weather. Its architects, a consortium of 7 species who prided themselves on refinement, had scrubbed the little world of anything that might inconvenience a mind at study. No storms, no predators, no seasons harsh enough to break a routine. The domes rose in pale tiers along the Terminator line, catching a permanent gentle dawn, and inside them the corridors were kept at a temperature that the average galactic student found soothing, and that the average galactic student would have described, if asked, as the only reasonable temperature a place could possibly be. Into this careful softness, on the morning the human was to arrive, walked Provost Elemaine Soar. She was teeth-aline, tall and reed-thin, her skin the color of old ivory and her 3 eyes arranged in a shallow triangle that lent her a permanent expression of mild, kindly surprise. She had run the Academy's exchange program for 209 standard years. In that time she had received the offspring of ambassadors, the prodigies of philosopher castes, the delicate savants of low-gravity worlds who had to be carried in cradles of magnetic thread lest their own bones betray them. She had a philosophy about exchange students, and the philosophy was this: they were guests, and guests were fragile, and the highest duty of a host was to ensure that no guest ever discovered how fragile they truly were. The human was, in her private estimation, going to be the most fragile guest yet. She had read the file. Everyone had read the file. Humanity had joined the wider community of worlds only 40 years prior, and in that time had produced exactly the reputation one would expect of a species from a marginal planet. A reputation for enthusiasm, for sentimentality, for a strange and touching willingness to attach emotional weight to objects and animals that could not possibly reciprocate. Their homeworld was catalogued as a Class 3 biosphere, survivable, temperate in patches, unremarkable. Their exports were music and grain. Their diplomats wept at concerts. They were, in the gentle consensus of the Bright Verge faculty, a young and hopeful people, and the girl who was coming to them was surely a flower of that hopefulness, some bright, breakable child sent to learn among her betters. Her name was Ren Adisa Okonkwo Vance. She was 19 standard years old. The file listed her prior education as field-based, non-standard, records incomplete. Provost Soar had frowned at that line for some time, and then decided, charitably, that human record-keeping was simply young. "You will want to warm the arrival lounge by 2 degrees, she told her aide, a nervous little phallus named Bee-Pit who scuttled at her heels on 6 padded legs. Humans come from a warm world, and soften the lighting. Their eyes are said to be sensitive. 2 degrees. Softer light." Bee-Pit made the notations in the air with a flicker of pheromone script. "And the seating, Provost. The medical annex suggested a reclining cradle in case the girl is fatigued from transit." A reclining cradle, yes. And water, they require a great deal of water and they take it internally through the mouth and they become distressed if deprived. Have a supply ready. Warm, not cold. Cold water shocks them. None of this was quite true. All of it had been assembled from a decade-old cultural primer written by a teeth-aline anthropologist who had spent a single afternoon on a human orbital station and had come away with the impression that humans were a kind of large, sociable, easily startled aquatic mammal. The primer was very popular. It was gentle, and it flattered its readers, and it made everyone feel that they understood humans, which is the most a primer is ever really asked to do. So the lounge was warmed. The light was softened. The cradle was set out, and the warm water, and a bowl of the sweetest fruit the commissary could synthesize, in case the girl needed comforting. Provost Soar stood at the center of it all in her formal robe of welcome gray, and arranged her 3 eyes into their kindliest configuration, and waited for something delicate to come through the door. The airlock cycled. The girl who stepped through was not large by the standards of the tall species, but she moved through the doorway the way a load-bearing thing moves through a doorway, and every faculty member present felt, without being able to say why, that the room had gotten smaller. She was dark-skinned, her hair cropped close to the skull in a way that suggested it had been cut for function rather than display. She wore a plain traveling coat, gray and heavy, and boots that had clearly been resoled more than once. Over one shoulder hung a single bag, and the bag was not large, and she carried it as though it weighed nothing, and it did not occur to anyone in the room until much later that a bag of that size, packed for a full academic year, ought to have weighed a great deal, and that she was carrying it one-handed and unbothered because to her it did not. But that came later. In the first moment, what everyone noticed was her stillness. The delicate savants Provost Soar had welcomed over the years had all shared a quality of trembling, a readiness to flinch, a body forever bracing against a world it found too loud. This girl did not tremble. She stood in the softened light and let her gaze move once around the room, unhurried, cataloging exits and sightlines and the placement of every body present. And though she did it so smoothly that most of the observers registered it only as poise, Provost Soar, who was old, and who had a good eye, felt the first faint thread of something she could not name pull tight in her chest. "Welcome," the provost said in the trade tongue warmly. "Welcome to the bright verge. You must be exhausted from your journey. Please sit, rest. There is water." Wren looked at the reclining cradle. She looked at the bowl of comforting fruit. She looked at the water, warm and waiting in its soft-edged vessel, and something passed across her face that an experienced reader of humans might have identified as the effort of not laughing. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was low and even. "I'm all right. It was a short trip." It had not been a short trip. It had been 11 days in a transit pod rated for a species that slept 20 hours out of every 24, in a pod she had been too tall to fully lie down in, on rations calibrated for a metabolism a third the speed of her own. She had spent the 11 days doing maintenance drills in the 2 square meters of clear floor, and reading the academy's entire public curriculum, and sleeping 4 hours a night because 4 hours was what she was used to and more than 4 felt like waste. She was not tired. She had trained since before she could remember, in the specific discipline of not being tired when tiredness would be a liability, and she did not yet know that she would need that discipline here, but the habit did not care whether she needed it. It simply held. "Of course," said Provost Soar, who did not believe her, and who put the disbelief down to the touching human tendency toward bravado. "B-Pit will show you to your quarters. We've prepared the low residence ground level, no stairs, close to the medical annex. I hope you'll find it comfortable." "I'm sure I will," said Wren, and picked up her bag, and followed the little scuttling aide out of the lounge, and left behind her a silence that Provost Soar found, on reflection, difficult to account for. The low residence had been designed for students who could not manage stairs. It was on the ground floor of the residential tier, its windows looking out on the manicured Null Garden, its furnishings padded, its every corner rounded to prevent injury. B-Pit ushered Wren inside with a flurry of pheromone apology. "It is small, I know," the little phallus fretted, "but it is safe, very safe, no sharp edges. The medical annex is only 40 meters, if you should feel unwell in the night, and the walls will summon aid if you fall. You have only to call out." "If I fall," Wren repeated. "Humans are, forgive me, I read that your bones are quite dense, but even so, a fall in unfamiliar gravity, one worries." "What's the gravity here?" "0.81 standard," said B-Pit, proud to know it. Wren nodded slowly. 0.81, lighter than home, lighter than anywhere she had ever fought or run or fallen. On the world where she had grown up, the gravity ran at 1.34, and that was the least of the things that world had done to her, and standing here in this padded room at 4/5 of her native weight she felt, for the first time in years, faintly, absurdly buoyant, as though she might jump and simply keep going. "Thank you, B-Pit," she said. This is fine. The Follis hesitated at the door. There was something the anthropological primer had told the faculty to do upon leaving a human alone for the first time, to reassure them, because humans were social pack creatures and became anxious in solitude. B-Pit had memorized the phrase. "You are not alone here," the aide recited earnestly. "We are all around you. You are safe among friends." Wren, who had spent the loneliest years of her childhood learning that safety was a thing you manufactured with your own hands and never received as a gift, looked down at the small, anxious creature in the doorway and felt an unexpected tenderness. "Thank you," she said again, and meant it, and the door closed, and she was alone in the padded room with her single bag, and she set the bag down, and she stood very still in the center of the floor and listened to the building. She had been listening to buildings her whole life. It was one of the first things she had been taught before letters, before numbers. At an age when other children were learning the names of animals, she had been learning the sound a structure makes when it is sound, and the different sound it makes when it is not. The academy hummed. Its air handlers cycled on a 14-second rhythm. Its power ran clean and constant, no fluctuation, no strain. There was no sound of stress anywhere in the walls, no groan of a structure fighting to hold, no tick of metal contracting against a cold it was not built for. Nothing here was fighting anything. The whole place existed in a state of profound, uninterrupted ease. It was the most peaceful thing she had ever heard, and it made the back of her neck prickle, because in her experience peace that complete meant that something, somewhere, had not yet gone wrong. And the not yet was always the dangerous part. She unpacked in 4 minutes. She laid out her few clothes, her field kit, a whetstone, a folded photograph she did not look at, and a slim black case that she set on the shelf without opening. Then she did the thing she always did in a new place, the thing that would have baffled every soul at the Bright Verge had they seen it. She walked the room's perimeter with her hand on the wall, learning where it was strong and where it was thin, finding the 2 points where she could brace her back and see the door, memorizing the space until her body could move through it in full dark. Only then did she sit, not in the padded cradle, but on the floor, cross-legged, her back to the strongest wall, and take a long breath, and let the 11 days settle, and think about why she had come. She had not come because she was a flower of human hopefulness. She had come because she had been sent, and she had been sent because a man named Colonel Idris Vance, who was her father, and who had raised her on a world that killed the unready, believed that his daughter had learned everything her home could teach her, and that the only thing left to sharpen her was a place that would not understand her at all. "Go somewhere soft," he had told her on the launch platform in the last hour before the pod took her up. He had not embraced her. He had never once embraced her in 19 years, and she had long ago stopped grieving the absence and started reading it as its own kind of message. Go somewhere that thinks it's the top of the mountain. Learn how the people who have never bled think. You'll need it. The galaxy's full of them, and one day you'll have to command them, or protect them, or bury them, and you won't be able to do any of it if you can't stand to be in a room with them. And if they never understand me, she had asked. Her father had looked at her with the flat gray eyes she had inherited, the eyes that gave nothing, and for a moment she had thought he would say something soft, because it was the last hour, and even he might be permitted something soft in the last hour. "They won't," he had said. "That's not the assignment. The assignment is that you understand them. Go." And she had gone. And now she sat on the floor of a padded room on a moon that had never known weather, in the gentlest place she had ever been, and she understood that her father had been right, because already, 3 hours in, she could feel how completely these people had misread her, and she knew from long practice that being misread was a weapon if you were patient and a grave if you were not. She would be patient. She had been trained in patience the way other people were trained in mathematics, rigorously, from childhood, until it became a reflex deeper than thought. Down the corridor, in the faculty commons, Provost Soar was already receiving the first reports, and the reports were faintly troubling, though no one could say precisely why. "She refused the cradle," said the medical officer, a soft gray phallus named Ohan. "She refused the water. She asked the aide for the local gravity and the structural rating of her quarters." "The structural rating, Provost? Why would an exchange student want to know the load tolerance of her own walls?" "She is young," said Provost Soar, "and far from home and looking for things to control. It is natural. We will give her small responsibilities and she will settle." "There is also the matter of the transit pod," said Ohan, and here she hesitated. "The dockmaster inspected it after she disembarked. There was damage, interior damage, deep impact marks in the pod's structural bracing, regular, spaced, as though something had been striking the bracing, hard, many thousands of times, over the course of the journey." The Commons went quiet. "Striking it with what?" the provost asked. "Her hands," said Ohan, "and her feet. The dockmaster ran a residue scan. It was her. She spent 11 days in transit striking the walls of her pod with her bare hands and feet, tens of thousands of times, hard enough to deform structural bracing rated for hull stress." The medical officer's antennae had gone quite pale. "Provost, we welcomed a delicate exchange student. I am not certain that is what stepped off that pod." Provost Soar said nothing for a long moment. Outside the Commons window, the permanent gentle dawn lay over the Null Garden, and everything was soft, and everything was safe, and somewhere down the corridor, a 19-year-old girl sat on the floor with her back to the strongest wall and listened to a building that had never once had to fight to stand. "She is training," the provost said at last, and her voice was calm, but the thread in her chest had pulled tighter. "Even in transit, 11 days, alone." She turned from the window. "Ohan, pull her file again, the full file, the parts we didn't bother to read because we thought we already knew what she was." The full file, it turned out, was not much fuller. Humanity had been in the community of worlds for only 4 decades, and its record-keeping conventions did not map cleanly onto galactic standards, and much of what should have been in Ren Adisa Okonkwo Vance's file was marked with the human notation restricted, or the even more frustrating notation NA, but there were fragments. There was a birth world designation that Provost Soar had glossed over on first reading because it had meant nothing to her, and which now, reading more carefully, she found she could not gloss. The girl had not been born on the human homeworld. She had been born on a place the file called, in the flat human way, Tarsi's IV. And beside that designation, in the galactic survey annotations that some cautious bureaucrat had appended, was a classification code that Provost Soar had to look up, because in 209 years of receiving the flowers of gentle worlds she had never once had cause to encounter it. The code was DW1. Deathworld Category 1. The survey's own definition scrolled up beneath it, dry and terrible. A world whose native conditions are lethal to unprotected galactic standard physiology within a median span of 11 minutes. Gravity, atmospheric toxicity, thermal extremity, native fauna, and ambient radiation, each independently sufficient to cause mortality. Colonization strongly discouraged. Human settlement noted. Sustainability disputed. Population figures unverified. Provost Soar read it twice. Then she read the next line, which was a note appended by the Human Liaison Office, and which she suspected had been written by someone who had assumed no one at a gentle academy would ever bother to read this far. Tarsi's IV colony established by contract military settlement 41 years prior. Population raised under continuous survival conditions. Note: the phrase "raised under" is used advisedly. Children of Tarsi's IV do not attend the colony, they are the colony. Physical conditioning begins at ambulation. By galactic standard adolescence, a Tarsi's-born human possesses stress tolerance, reflex speed, and structural bone density in excess of most species-dedicated military castes. Recommend caution in all assumptions. She set the file down. 0.134 gravity, she thought, and then corrected herself. 1.34. A world that pulled at a body a third again as hard as the pull she stood in now. A world that killed the unready in 11 minutes. And this girl had not visited that world, had not studied it from orbit, had not read about it in a primer. This girl had been born on it, and had learned to walk on it, and had grown to 19 years on it. And every hour of every one of those years the world had been trying, patiently and without malice, to kill her, and she had not let it. And Provost Soar had welcomed her with warm water and a bowl of comforting fruit, and a padded room with no sharp edges. "Oh, hon," she said quietly, "the girls' quarters, the medical annex 40 meters away, the walls that summon aid if she falls." She almost laughed, and the almost laugh had no humor in it. "We built her a nursery. We built a nursery for someone who spent 11 days in transit hitting a hull-rated wall so she would not go soft." "We could not have known," said Ohan. "We could have read the file," said Provost Soar. "We chose to know what she was before we looked. That is a different thing." She rose. "I want to see her tested, not as a threat. I mean placement. She is here to study. We must place her in the right cohorts. Physical, cognitive, all of it. Standard intake evaluation. And Ohan, do not soften it. Whatever the instinct is to go gentle on her, resist it. She will read gentleness as an insult, and I think we have insulted her enough for one day." The standard intake evaluation at the Bright Verge was a placid affair. It was not designed to find the ceiling of a student's ability. It was designed to find the floor, so that instruction could be built up from there without ever taxing a delicate mind. There were reasoning puzzles and pattern completions, and a brief, courteous physical assessment intended mostly to establish what accommodations a student might need. No one had ever failed it. No one had ever, in the memory of the faculty, come anywhere near its upper bounds, because its upper bounds had been set at a level the designers considered generously high, and that reality had never once threatened to exceed. Wren arrived for her evaluation at the appointed hour, in the same plain gray coat, and greeted the 3 examiners with the same low, even courtesy, and sat where she was asked to sit and waited. The cognitive portion came first. The lead examiner, a stately isk named Prime Deleu, whose species communicated in slow harmonic chords, presented the reasoning puzzles one at a time, allowing, as the protocol specified, a generous interval for each. The protocol allowed 90 seconds per puzzle. It expected most students to use 60. Wren answered the first puzzle in 4 seconds. Prime Deleu's chord faltered. He presented the second. Wren answered in 3. The third was a spatial rotation problem that the protocol flagged as advanced, optional, expect non-completion in standard cohorts. She looked at it for perhaps 2 seconds and gave the answer, and then, because the examiner's harmonics had gone strange and uncertain, she added mildly, "The problem's underspecified, by the way. There are 2 valid rotations that satisfy the constraints. I gave you the one with lower total displacement. If you wanted the other one, you should say so in the framing." There was a silence in the evaluation chamber. "She is correct," said the second examiner, a phallus checking. "There are 2 valid solutions. The protocol has listed only one. The protocol has listed only one for 400 years. Prime Deleu, who had administered this evaluation 11,000 times, set aside the reasoning puzzles with a hand that was not quite steady and moved to the physical assessment, because the physical assessment was simple and reassuring, and he wanted, very much, to do something simple and reassuring. "This part is brief," he told her, his chords deliberately warm. "We ask only that you demonstrate a few basic movements so that we may understand your body's needs. There is no pass or fail. Take all the time you require. First, if you would, a simple grip assessment. Take the bar and squeeze, only as hard as is comfortable. We are measuring for accommodation, not for strength." He handed her the grip bar. It was a calibrated instrument, a smooth cylinder wired to register the force of a student's grasp, and it had a maximum registration of 400 newtons, which was a figure the designers had chosen because it was roughly double the strongest grip ever recorded from any student in the Academy's history, and they had wanted a comfortable margin. Wren took the bar. She looked at the examiner. "Only as hard as is comfortable." "Only as hard as is comfortable," Prime DeLu confirmed gently. So she squeezed only as hard as was comfortable, which for a girl born on a 1.34 world and raised to haul and climb and hold on when letting go meant falling, was not very hard at all. It was, to her, an idle pressure, the pressure you might use to test a fruit for ripeness. The bar registered 400 newtons, held there for an instant, and then emitted a small mechanical sound of despair and cracked down its length, the casing splitting, the readout freezing at its maximum and then going dark. Wren opened her hand. The bar sat in her palm, broken, its two halves held together by a single wire. "I'm sorry," she said, and she genuinely was. "Was that too hard?" "You said comfortable. That was comfortable. I can go softer." No one answered her. The three examiners were looking at the broken bar, and then at her hand, which was unmarked and idle, and then at each other, and Prime DeLu's harmonics had gone entirely silent, which among the ISK is the equivalent of a species that has forgotten how to breathe. "That will not be necessary," he managed at last. "That will no, we have what we need, thank you." They did not have what they needed. They had, in fact, no idea what they had, because the physical assessment protocol contained no provision for a student who exceeded the instrument's maximum, let alone destroyed it while describing the effort as comfortable. The examiners conferred in low, urgent chords while Wren sat quietly and waited, and it was decided in the end to simply record the result as exceeds available measurement and refer the matter upward, which is what institutions do when reality has embarrassed their instruments. Wren, for her part, understood exactly what had happened, and understood it with a familiar, weary clarity. She had broken their toy. She had not meant to, she had done precisely what she was asked, no more, but the asking had been built on the assumption that her comfortable was near their maximum, and the assumption had been wrong by a margin so wide that her lightest effort had shattered a thing designed to withstand twice their strongest. This was going to be the shape of everything here. She could already tell. Every instrument in this soft place was calibrated for people who had never once needed to be strong, and she was going to spend the year breaking their instruments simply by being ordinary, by her own standards, and they were going to look at her the way these three were looking at her now, as though she had done something violent, when all she had done was exist at her own true scale in a place that had built itself around the assumption that no one true scale could be this large. "Go somewhere that thinks it's the top of the mountain," her father had said. She was beginning to understand that these people did not think they were at the top of the mountain. They did not know there was a mountain. They had lived their whole lives on a gentle plain and had never once looked up, and the softness of them was not arrogance. Not exactly. It was innocence, the specific innocence of a people who had never been tested and did not know that testing existed. And her father had sent her here, into the middle of that innocence, and she did not yet fully understand why, but she trusted him, because trusting him had kept her alive on a world that killed the untrusting, and she resolved to keep watching until the reason showed itself. The results of the evaluation reached Provost Soar within the hour, and she read them in her office with the door closed, and when she had finished reading them, she sat for a long time without moving. Exceeds available measurement. Cognitive results, all upper bounds surpassed. Recommend reevaluation with instruments not currently in Academy inventory. Physical results, grip assessment terminated due to instrument failure. Strength estimate not obtainable, note appended by Prime DeLu. The student describes her maximal demonstrated force as comfortable. We do not know her ceiling. We possess no means of finding it. I have administered this evaluation for 400 years. I request reassignment. Provost Soar set the results down and looked out her window at the Null Garden, where a pair of visiting savants from a low-gravity world were being wheeled along the path in their magnetic cradles, laughing softly at some shared joke, fragile and content, and entirely unaware that anything in the universe could be otherwise. She thought about the phrase the human liaison office had used. Children of Tarsi's IV do not attend the colony, they are the colony. She had spent 209 years believing that the highest duty of a host was to protect the guest from ever learning how fragile they were. And a girl had walked through her airlock, and Provost Soar saw now, with a slow and spreading vertigo, that for the first time in 2 centuries she had the relationship exactly backward. The fragile ones were not the guests. The fragile ones were the hosts, every one of them. The whole gentle, innocent, unbroken academy, every laughing savant, every soft-walled residence, every instrument calibrated for people who had never needed to be strong. And into the middle of that fragility she had welcomed something that a death world had spent 19 years forging and had failed to break, and she had put it in a nursery, and told it that it was safe among friends. She almost laughed again. She did not. Instead, she opened a channel to the human liaison office, 3 star systems away, and composed her message with great care. And the message asked only one question, and the question was, what is she for? Because Provost Soar had begun to suspect that no colony born on a category, 1 death world, sent its children anywhere by accident, and that a people who did not send children but forged them did not spend a forged thing on an exchange program for the mere pleasure of the exchange. There was a reason this girl had been sent to the gentlest place in the sector, and the provost, who was old and who had a good eye, wanted to know what it was before the reason arrived on its own. The reply, when it came, would take 3 days to cross the distance. In those 3 days, Ren Adisa Okonkwo Vance would attend her first classes and meet the students of the Bright Verge, and the students of the Bright Verge would learn, one small astonishment at a time, exactly what had come to live among them. The students of the Bright Verge were not cruel. It is important to understand this, because what happened between them and Ren could easily be mistaken for cruelty, and it was not. It was something gentler and, in its way, more insulting. It was condescension so complete that it did not know its own name. Her cohort was assigned by age, and so she found herself among students in their late adolescence and early adulthood, the sons and daughters of the Bright Verge's constituent species. And on her first morning in the shared instructional hall, she was received with a warmth that would have been touching if it had not been so entirely built on the assumption that she was helpless. The ringleader of the cohort, insofar as a group of gentle students had a ringleader, was a young Tetheline named Ves Andriel, Provost Soar's own grandnephew, tall and graceful and effortlessly kind, the kind of young man who had never in his life encountered a problem his charm could not smooth. He appointed himself Ren's guide within the first hour, and he did it beautifully, and every beautiful thing he did was an insult he could not have recognized as one. "You'll want to sit here near the front," he told her, guiding her to a padded bench. "The material moves quickly, and I know your people are new to formal study. Don't be discouraged if you fall behind. I'll help you catch up. We all will. That's what the Verge is for." He smiled, 3 eyes crinkling, radiant with the pleasure of his own generosity. "You're very brave to come all this way. I want you to know that." "Very brave." "Thank you," said Ren, and sat where she was told, and did not tell him that she had read the entire year's curriculum during her transit and found it, by the standards of the education a death world gives its children, roughly equivalent to the material she had mastered by the age of 12. Not because she was a genius, but because on Tarsi's IV the curriculum and survival were the same document, and a child who fell behind in the curriculum did not receive a kind young man's help catching up. A child who fell behind on Tarsi's IV died. This concentrates the attention. The first class was structural engineering, which the students found dry, and which Ren found the closest thing to home she had encountered since arrival, because structural engineering on a death world is not an abstraction. It is the difference between a shelter that holds through a pressure storm and a shelter that does not. And Wren had been calculating load tolerances and failure modes since before she could read, in her head at speed, because the storms did not wait for you to find a stylus. The instructor, a patient old ISK, posed a problem to the class. A habitat truss under a described load, find the point of failure. It was, by the curriculum's own notation, a problem intended to occupy the cohort for the full instructional period, with the expectation that most would not finish, and that finishing was not the point. Wren solved it while the instructor was still describing it. She did not mean to be conspicuous. She simply saw the answer the way a musician hears a wrong note immediately, involuntarily, and when the instructor finished the description and asked rhetorically, "Now, where do we think the failure will occur?" Wren, out of the reflex of 19 years in which failing to identify a failure point had consequences, said, "The third node from the anchor. Under the described load it'll go in about 40 seconds, but that's not the real problem. The real problem is the anchor itself. Your load's fine. Your anchor's undersized for the substrate you named. It'll pull out of the ground before the truss ever fails. You've built a perfect structure on a foundation that can't hold it." The class turned to look at her. Ves Andriel wore an expression of delighted encouragement, the expression of a young man watching a small child attempt something above its ability. "That's a wonderful guess," he said warmly. "Really, isn't it wonderful that she's trying?" The instructor did not answer for a moment. The instructor was looking at the problem. The instructor was, specifically, looking at the anchor specification, which he had included as flavor, as set dressing, and which no student in his long career had ever thought to question, and which, now that a girl from a death world had pointed at it, was, in fact, undersized for the named substrate. The whole problem was built on the assumption that the foundation was sound, because, in the gentle world of the curriculum, foundations were always sound. It had never occurred to anyone that the ground itself might be the thing that failed. On a death world, the ground was the first thing that failed. On a death world, you learned to trust nothing you had not personally tested, least of all the earth. "She is correct," the instructor said slowly. "The anchor is undersized. The problem is flawed. It has been flawed for as long as I have taught it, and no one has ever seen it, because no one has ever thought to distrust the foundation." He looked at Wren with an expression the young Teethaline could not read, but that was, in fact, the beginning of respect. "How did you see it?" Wren considered how to answer honestly without frightening them. "Where I'm from," she said, "the ground moves. Nothing holds unless you make it hold, and things you didn't build to hold will kill you when they let go. So you learn to look at the thing everyone trusts and ask what happens when it fails. It's just habit. I wasn't trying to be clever." "Where you're from," Ves repeated, still smiling, still not understanding. "Yes, of course, your little colony. It must have been very rustic." He said the word rustic the way one says a word one has been saving up, a word one is pleased to have found for a charming, backward place. "You'll find things are different here, more refined, but it's good that you're bringing your folk wisdom. It's very quaint." Wren looked at the beautiful, radiant, condescending young man, and she thought about her father saying the assignment is that you understand them, and she understood him. She understood Ves Andriel completely. She understood that he had never once been afraid, that he had never held a shelter together with his own back through a storm, that he had never watched the ground he trusted open up beneath someone he loved. She understood that his condescension was not malice, but the innocence of a person the universe had never bothered to correct, and she found, to her mild surprise, that she did not resent him for it. You do not resent a child for not knowing the dark. You only make sure you are standing between the child and the dark when the dark arrives. And she was increasingly certain the dark would arrive. She could not have said why. It was the same instinct that had prickled the back of her neck on the first night, the sense of a peace too complete, a not yet stretched too long. Something in this soft sector had never been tested, and untested things in her experience did not stay untested forever. The days settled into a rhythm. Ren attended her classes and outperformed the curriculum so far beyond its bounds that the faculty quietly stopped expecting her to work within it and simply gave her the graduate materials, and then the research materials, and then, in the case of the old structural engineer, his own personal problem set that he had been unable to crack for a decade, which she cracked in an afternoon and returned to him with a note that read, "Gently, you were assuming the material was isotropic. It isn't." The rest follows. The students, meanwhile, continued to be kind to her in the specific way that never once revised its estimate of what she was. They invited her to their recreations, gentle games, a kind of floating ball sport played in low gravity, meditative and slow, and Ren joined, and moved through their meditative slow game like a storm moving through a garden, not out of any wish to dominate but simply because her body, forged at 1.34, could not help moving at deathworld speed, and she had to consciously, constantly, throttle herself down to keep from hurting anyone. She spent every recreation period in a state of deliberate restraint, and the students took her restraint for the tentative caution of a newcomer, and praised her for trying, and never once suspected that she was holding back with every fiber of her discipline to keep from breaking them. It could not last. Restraint that complete never lasts, and the thing that broke it was, of all things, an accident in the Null Garden, on an ordinary afternoon, in the 11th hour before the Human Liaison Office's reply was due to arrive. The Null Garden was the Academy's pride, a great domed space where the artificial gravity was tuned down to a bare whisper, and the students went there to drift and rest, and let their bodies float in the gentle non-weight that their soft worlds had never quite provided. There was a maintenance gantry that ran along the dome's upper curve, a slim track for the little service drones that tended the garden's living architecture, and it was on this gantry, 40 meters above the garden floor, that a drone malfunctioned and struck a support strut, and the strut, undersized as it happened, for a substrate that had shifted imperceptibly over 4 centuries, gave way. Ren was in the garden when it happened. She had come, as she often did, to be alone, because being alone was the only time she could stop throttling herself, and she was drifting near the dome's edge with her eyes closed when she heard the sound. She heard it before anyone else, because she had spent her whole life listening to buildings, and she knew the sound a structure makes when it is about to stop being a structure. Her eyes opened. 40 meters up, the gantry was failing, the strut had gone, and the section was folding, and it was folding directly above a cluster of students who had drifted together to watch the drones, 4 of them, and among the 4 was Ves Andriel, and none of them had looked up, and none of them had ever in their lives had cause to develop the instinct that makes a body look up. There was, by any reasonable calculation, no time. The gantry section was already falling. 40 meters in whisper gravity is a slow fall, but it is not a slow enough fall, and the students were directly beneath it, and they were drifting, weightless, unable to push off anything, unable to move, and they had perhaps 6 seconds before a half-ton of failing gantry came down through the exact volume of space their bodies occupied. 6 seconds is not enough time, not for a body raised in gentleness, not for a body that has never had to move fast because nothing has ever tried to kill it. But Ren Adisa Okonkwo Vance had been born on a world where 6 seconds was the entire difference between the quick and the dead, where the ground moved, and the storms came without warning, and the only children who lived to 19 were the ones whose bodies had learned, below the level of thought, to convert terror into motion in the space of a single heartbeat. And her body, which had spent 3 weeks throttled down to a crawl so as not to frighten the gentle people around her, was suddenly, completely, unleashed. She did not decide to move. Deciding takes time she did not have. She was simply, between one instant and the next, moving, pushing off the dome's edge with a force that sent her across the garden faster than anyone present had ever seen a living body travel. Not drifting through the whisper gravity, but driving through it. Her deathworld muscles treating the whole vast dome as a thing to be crossed now. And she crossed it. 40 meters of empty air, in a flat, hard arc that put her among the drifting students in a little under 2 seconds. She had 4 seconds left and 4 students, and a falling half-ton of gantry, and she did the only thing there was time to do. She hit them. She reached the cluster at speed and she struck them apart. Not gently, there was no time for gentle. She drove into the 4 drifting bodies and shoved them in 4 directions with 4 separate blows, each one calibrated in a fraction of an instant to be exactly as hard as it needed to be to move a body clear and not 1 increment harder. And the 4 students went spinning away in 4 directions like a struck constellation, out of the fatal volume, clear, safe. And Wren was in the middle of the space they had occupied, and the gantry was coming down, and she had used her last second on them and had none left for herself. So she did not try to save herself. She turned in the non-weight, and she set her back against nothing and her hands up toward the falling mass. And a girl who had once described snapping a hull-rated grip bar as comfortable braced herself in the empty air to catch half a ton of failing gantry with her bare hands. Because the students were clear, but the debris was still coming down, and there were more students below, on the garden floor, in its path, and someone had to stop it, and there was no one else. And there had never in her whole life been anyone else, and this at least was familiar. The gantry came down, and Wren caught it. She caught it, and the catching was the hardest thing she had done since arriving at the bright verge. And it was hard not because the mass was great, but because catching a falling mass in whisper gravity is a problem with no floor to push against, no ground to root into, only your own body and the momentum you brought, and the terrible physics of trying to be an anchor when there is nothing to anchor to. She had in that final second done the calculation the way she did all calculations, beneath thought, at the speed of reflex. She could not stop the gantry by opposing it. There was nothing behind her to brace against, and a body that tries to stop a falling mass with nothing behind it simply travels with the mass and is crushed at the bottom. So she did not oppose it. She met it and turned with it, and used the 2 seconds of momentum she had left in her own body, the momentum from her drive across the garden, as a counter, spending it all at once, wrenching the falling section sideways as it came, redirecting half a ton of debris out of its fatal vertical line and into the empty margin of the dome, where it struck the padded garden wall and crumpled harmlessly against a surface designed to injure no one. The physics of it were brutal. She took the full transfer through her arms and her shoulders and the long muscles of her back, all the force of the redirect channeling through a single 19-year-old body, and a body raised in gentleness would have come apart. Her body did not come apart. Her body had been forged for exactly this, for the moment when everything came down at once, and there was no floor and no help and only what you were, and she was Tarsi's-born, and Tarsi's-born do not come apart. She rode the transfer down, and hit the padded wall herself a half-second after the debris, and rebounded, and came to rest drifting in the whisper gravity with her chest heaving and her hands trembling, and a long shallow tear opening across one forearm where a spar had caught her, bleeding slowly in the non-weight, the blood beating and drifting away in small dark spheres. The null garden was utterly silent. The 4 students she had struck clear were drifting at the dome's far edges, spinning slowly, unhurt, staring. The students on the garden floor were staring. And Ves Andriel, who had been directly beneath the failing gantry, who would by any calculation have been dead, was drifting near the wall where her blow had sent him, one hand pressed to the place on his shoulder where she had struck him. It would bruise. She had hit him hard. There had been no time for anything but hard, and his 3 eyes were fixed on the girl bleeding quietly in the center of the dome, and his beautiful, effortless, condescending face had come entirely apart, and behind it was something raw and very young and very frightened, and it was the first true thing his face had ever done. "You," he said, and could not finish it. Ren drifted and breathed and let the adrenaline burn down through her the way she had been taught, not fighting it, letting it run its course. Her forearm hurt. That was fine. Pain was information. She cataloged it, judged it minor, set it aside. She looked at the 4 students she had saved and confirmed with her eyes that they were whole, and only when she had confirmed it did she allow herself to relax, fractionally, the way she allowed herself so few things. "You're all right," she said, not a question, a verdict delivered to the room. "Nobody's broken. You're all right." And then, because they were still staring, because the silence had a quality she recognized, the silence of people whose entire understanding of the world had just been struck apart the way she had struck them apart, she added, more gently, the only reassurance she had. "It's over, it already stopped, you can breathe." They could not breathe. Not yet. Because they had just watched a thing they had spent 3 weeks pitying cross 40 meters of air in 2 seconds, strike 4 grown students clear of death with 4 precise blows, catch and redirect half a ton of falling debris with her bare hands, take a wound that would have hospitalized any of them, and then, bleeding, trembling, having done the impossible, turn to comfort them, to tell them it was over, to tell them they could breathe. The condescension of 3 weeks did not survive that afternoon. It could not. You cannot pity a thing that has just held the sky up off your body. In the space of 6 seconds, the students of the bright verge had been forced to revise, completely and permanently, their estimate of what had come to live among them, and the revision was not gentle, and it left them shaken in a way that gentleness had never once left them shaken. Provost Soar arrived within minutes, having been summoned by the garden's alarms, and she took in the scene, the crumpled gantry against the wall, the drifting students, the girl bleeding quietly in the center of the dome with her wound already clotting because Tarsi's-born clot fast, and she understood all of it at once, and she felt the thread that had been pulling tight in her chest since the first day finally, fully, draw taut. "Get her to the annex," she said, "the wound." "It's shallow," said Ren. "It's already closing. I don't need the annex." She drifted herself upright, oriented to the faint gravity, set her feet against the floor as it reasserted itself near the dome's base. "But you should look at your other struts. That one failed at the anchor." The substrate's shifted. It's the same failure mode from the class problem, the undersized anchor, except this one's real, and it's been real for a while, and it's not the only one. She looked up at the dome, reading it the way she read every structure. "You have at least 3 more struts on that gantry sitting on the same shifted substrate. They'll go too. Not today, but they'll go. You should close the garden until they're re-anchored." Provost Soar looked at the girl who, 3 minutes after nearly dying to save 4 strangers, was calmly diagnosing the systemic structural fault that had almost killed them, so that it would not kill anyone else, and she felt something she had not felt in 209 years of gentle stewardship. She felt protected. By a 19-year-old. By a guest she had put in a nursery. "Close the garden," she said to her aide without taking her eyes off Ren. "Re-anchor everything, and send the structural survey to her. Let her check our work." A pause. "Let her check all of it, every structure on this moon, if she is willing." Ren inclined her head once. "I'm willing," she said. "You've got beautiful buildings here, perfect craftsmanship." And then, because it was true, and because she had decided the kindest thing she could do for these people was to stop letting them believe comfortable lies. "But you built them all assuming the ground would never move. Everything you've made is perfect on the assumption that nothing will ever go wrong. And I've spent my whole life on a world where something always goes wrong. So, yes. Let me check your work. I think you're going to need it." That evening, Provost Soar sat alone in her office, and finally allowed herself to think the thought she had been circling for 3 weeks, and the thought was this. She had been wrong about the shape of the universe. She had believed that the gentle worlds were the summit of civilization. That softness was what you achieved once you had risen above the brute struggle of existence, that the delicate savants in their magnetic cradles represented the direction all worthy life was traveling. She had believed that a place that had eliminated all hardship was a place that had won. And a girl from a death world had shown her, in 6 seconds, that a place that had eliminated all hardship was not a place that had won. It was a place that had never been tested, and an untested thing does not know its own weakness, and a thing that does not know its own weakness is not strong. It is merely lucky, and luck is not a foundation. Luck is the undersized anchor holding up the perfect truss fine, right up until the ground moves, and the ground always, eventually, moves. The Bright Verge was the most refined institution in the sector, and it was built on luck, and it did not know it. And a 19-year-old girl born on a world that killed the unready had walked through its airlock and seen the truth of it in an afternoon. Her father had known. Provost Soar saw that now. Go somewhere that thinks it's the top of the mountain. He had not sent his daughter here to be educated. He had sent her here because he had looked at the gentle sector from his death world with his flat gray eyes, and he had seen exactly what Provost Soar was only now beginning to see. That the softest, most refined, most beautiful place in the region was also the most fragile, the most untested, the most utterly unprepared for the day the ground moved. And he had sent his daughter into the middle of it, and the provost did not yet know why, but she was no longer certain it was only for the girl's education. She was beginning to suspect it was for theirs. The reply from the Human Liaison Office arrived the next morning, 3 days after she had sent her question. It was brief, and it was signed by a name Provost Soar did not recognize, Colonel Idris Vance, Tarsai's IV Contract Military Settlement. And she understood, reading the signature, that she was hearing not from a bureaucrat but from the girl's own father, who had apparently been informed that the Bright Verge was asking questions about his daughter, and had chosen to answer them himself. The message read, "You asked what she is for. I will tell you plainly, because I think you have earned a plain answer, and because I think she is beginning to earn one from you. She is not for anything. She is a person, not a weapon, whatever your instruments have told you. But you asked the real question underneath, which is why I sent her to you and that I will answer. Your sector has not been tested in 1,000 years. Mine tests us every 11 minutes. I have watched your kind from my world for 40 years, and I have seen a civilization so refined it has forgotten that refinement is a privilege the universe grants and revokes at will. You believe you are safe. You are not safe. No one is safe. You have merely been fortunate, and you have mistaken fortune for virtue. And one day your fortune will change, as all fortune changes, and when it does you will need people among you who know what to do when the ground moves, because your own people will not know, having never once had to learn. I did not send my daughter to be educated by you. Forgive me. I sent her to be the person in the room who knows what to do when your fortune changes. I did not know when it would change. I only knew that it would because it always does. Read the last line of this message carefully, Provost, because it is the reason I am writing to you myself and not through my office. Your fortune is about to change, and she is the only one on your moon who will know what to do." Provost Soar read the last line 3 times. And then, from very far away, at the edge of the sector, on a long-range monitoring station that no one at the gentle Bright Verge had paid attention to in 100 years, an alarm that had never once sounded in the Academy's history began, softly at first and then not softly at all, to sound. There was one more thing that happened between the arrival of the alarm and the 17 hours of building, and it happened in the space of a single conversation, and it mattered more than anyone in the hall understood at the time. When Wren finished telling them the plan, the dark reactor, the decoy beacon, the hand-run power routing, a faculty member rose to object. He was a senior ISK named Harmonist Ulvith, an engineer of great reputation, and he was not a coward and he was not a fool. He was simply a man who had spent 400 years inside a set of rules that had never once failed him, and the rules told him that what the human girl proposed was impossible. "The conduits will not carry that load," he said, his chords precise and pained. They are rated for 1/10 of what your decoy beacon requires. To route that much power through them by hand without the safety governors is to risk a cascade failure that could destroy the very domes we are trying to save. It cannot be done. The specifications forbid it. I have followed these specifications for 4 centuries, and they have never once been wrong. Ren looked at him, and she did not argue, because she had learned on Tarsai's IV that arguing with a frightened expert was a waste of the one thing she could not spare. Instead, she asked a question. "Have you ever exceeded a specification," she said, "in 400 years? Have you ever once run a system past what the manual said it could take, and watched what actually happened, instead of what the manual said would happen?" Harmonist Olvith was silent. "No," Ren said, gently answering for him, "because you never had to. Nothing here has ever pushed you past the manual. So you believe the manual is the edge of the world. But the manual isn't the edge of the world. The manual is a promise made by someone cautious with a margin built in, and the margin is bigger than you think because the person who wrote it was cautious too. Where I'm from, we live in the margin. Every day. Because on my world the manual's numbers get you killed, they're written for a gentle place, and my place isn't gentle, so we learned exactly how far past the numbers a thing can really go before it breaks. Your conduits are rated for 1/10 of what I need. Fine. But rated isn't the same as capable. I've run the real numbers, the metallurgy, the thermal load, the actual failure threshold of the actual material, not the promise the manual made about it. Your conduits will carry 3/4 of what I need on their own. The other quarter I'll get by reinforcing the 6 worst runs, which I've already identified, and by keeping the current moving so nothing sits hot long enough to fail. It's tight. It's the tightest thing I've ever done, but it's not impossible. It only looks impossible from inside the manual." She held his gaze. "I'm asking you to step outside the manual for 17 hours. It's the most frightening thing I could ask of you, and I know it, and I'm asking anyway, because outside the manual is where I've lived my whole life, and I promise you there's ground out here. You just have to be willing to stand on it." Harmonist Olvith looked at the girl 1/3 his age who had just described, casually, running a lifetime's calculations in her head, and who was proposing to lead his gentle colleagues out past the only edge of the world he had ever known. And something in his 400-year certainty cracked. Not the way a weak thing cracks, but the way a shell cracks when what is inside it is finally ready to grow. "Show me the reinforcement runs," he said. "The 6 worst. If your numbers hold, I will follow you into the margin." They held, of course they held. She had run them beneath thought at speed, the way she ran everything. And when the old engineer checked her work, and he checked it meticulously because that was who he was, he found not a single error. And he found in the margins of her calculations small notes she had written to herself in the flat human hand. Notes like "This run is the one that scares me. Watch the junction and load will spike here at hour 12. Keep a body on it." And he understood, reading them, that the girl was not fearless. She was afraid. She was exactly as afraid as he was. The difference was that she had spent 19 years learning to work while afraid, to let the fear ride alongside the work without ever taking the wheel. And that discipline, not strength, not speed, but that one hard-won discipline, was the thing her death world had forged in her that no gentle world could ever forge in anyone. "You are afraid," he said, wondering. "You wrote that this run scares you, and yet you will do it." "Of course I'm afraid," Ren said. "Only a fool isn't afraid of a thing that can kill him. My father taught me that before I could walk. Courage isn't the absence of fear. That's not courage. That's just not understanding the situation. Courage is doing the work with the fear sitting right there beside you, close enough to touch, and not letting it move your hands. That's all it's ever been. That's the whole secret, and it's not even a secret, it's just a habit, and habits can be taught. I'm going to teach it to 200 people in 17 hours. She almost smiled again. "Starting with you. You've already learned the first part. You're afraid and you're still here. That's the whole beginning." And so the old engineer went out into the margin, and he took 30 of the faculty with him, and they reinforced the 6 worst runs under Wren's direction, and every one of them was afraid, and every one of them worked anyway, and by the 8th hour something had changed in the whole gathered body of the bright verge that none of them had words for yet. They were doing a thing they had believed impossible. They were doing it afraid. And the doing was teaching them, in their own hands and their own hammering hearts, the lesson that Tarsi's IV taught its children with the whole weight of a killing world, that a person is not measured by how much fear they feel, but by how much work they can do while feeling it. The gentlest people in the sector were learning the death world's one great truth, and they were learning it from a 19-year-old girl who had crossed 40 meters of air to save 4 strangers she had every reason to resent, and who was now spending the last strength she had to make certain the strangers, and everyone they loved, would live. By the 12th hour, when the load spiked at the junction exactly as Wren's note had warned, there was a body on it, Harmonist Ulvith himself, and Ves Andriel beside him, and the 2 of them held the current stable through the spike with their own hands on the manual overrides, sweating, terrified, entirely outside the manual, entirely in the margin, and entirely, for the first time in 400 years and 19 years respectively, alive in the way that only a tested thing is ever alive. When the spike passed and the junction held, the old Isk let out a long harmonic that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and Ves beside him said, Is this what her whole life is like?" And Harmonist Ulvith said, "Yes, I think it is. I think it is her whole life. And I think we owe her more than we will ever be able to repay, because she has lived like this since before she could walk, and she never once told us how hard it was, because to her it was simply Tuesday." They did not stop again. They worked the last 5 hours in the margin, afraid and steady, and the beacon rose, and the routing held, and when the 18th hour came and the reactor went dark on Wren's command, every soul on the moon had already learned the thing that would let them survive not just this swarm, but every dark thing the changing universe would ever send them. That they could work while afraid, and that the work would hold, and that this, not softness, not refinement, not the permanent gentle dawn, this was what strength had always actually been. The thing at the edge of the sector was not, at first, anything anyone could name. The bright verge had a monitoring station because every institution had a monitoring station. It was a formality, a piece of infrastructure inherited from a more cautious age, and maintained the way one maintains a lock on a door that has never needed locking. Its alarm protocols had been written 1,000 years earlier by people who no longer existed, in a sector that no longer remembered why it might need to be warned of anything. When the alarm sounded on the morning after Colonel Vance's message, the faculty's first response was not fear. It was confusion. Most of them did not know what the sound meant. Several assumed it was a malfunction. Provost Soar did not assume it was a malfunction. She had read the last line of the message 3 times, and she went to the monitoring station herself, and she stood in a chamber that had not held a living soul in a decade, and she read the data as it came in, and she felt the gentle certainties of 2 centuries fall away beneath her like an anchor pulling out of shifted ground. Something was coming. It came from the deep black beyond the sector's edge, from the unmapped dark that the gentle worlds had never bothered to map because nothing had ever come out of it. It was not a fleet. It was worse than a fleet in a way because a fleet could be reasoned with, and this could not. It was a migratory swarm, a vast slow river of silica-shelled organisms the size of transit pods, mindless and starving, that moved through the dark from feeding ground to feeding ground on cycles measured in millennia. And its cycle had, after 1,000 years, brought it back to the bright verge sector, and it was drawn to the moon's power output the way deep-sea things are drawn to light. And it was going to arrive in 19 hours, and when it arrived it would strip the Academy's domes for their materials and their energy, and it would not notice, in the stripping, that anyone had been living inside them. The faculty, when they understood, did the thing that gentle, untested people do when the ground moves for the first time. They came apart. Not all at once, and not shamefully. They were not cowards, only innocent, but they had no framework for catastrophe, no reflexes trained by disaster, no memory in their bodies of ever having survived a thing that tried to kill them. They gathered in the great instructional hall and they talked in rising, circling voices, and the talk went nowhere, because talk that has never been forged by consequence goes nowhere, and the 19 hours began to bleed away in beautiful, useless, frightened deliberation. Ren Adisa Okonkwo-Vance came into the hall in the second hour, in her plain gray coat, with her forearm still bearing the shallow closing wound from the Null Garden, and she stood at the back and listened to the gentle people fail to save themselves. And she felt, rising in her, the specific weary calm that Tarsai's IV had spent 19 years installing in her in place of panic. This was the thing her father had sent her here to be. She understood that now completely. She was the person in the room who knew what to do when the ground moved. And the ground was moving, and no one in the room knew what to do, and she was the only one, exactly as her father had said. She walked to the front of the hall. She did not raise her voice. She had learned, on a world where wasted breath was wasted life, that the quietest voice in a panicking room is the one people finally turn toward. "Stop talking," she said. "All of you, stop. You're spending the only thing you have left, which is time, and you're spending it on words, and words won't move that swarm 1 meter. So stop, and listen. Because I know what to do, and we have," she glanced at the station feed on the hall's great display, calculating, "about 17 hours to do it, and it's enough time, but only if you stop talking right now and start moving." The hall went silent. 200 years of refinement turned, at last, toward the girl from the death world, and asked to be told what to do, and the asking was the most honest thing the bright verge had done in 1,000 years. And Ren told them. She had, in the 2 hours of listening, already solved it, the whole thing, entire, the way she solved every structure beneath thought at speed. The swarm was drawn to the moon's power output. So the moon would stop putting out power. Not entirely, they could not survive with the dome's cold, but the great central reactor that lit the whole facility like a beacon in the dark would go dark, and in its place they would run a single small decoy beacon, mounted on the far side of the moon on the old monitoring station, cranked to maximum, screaming into the dark with all the power they could route to it. The swarm followed light. So they would give it a light to follow, and the light would not be the domes full of people. It would be an empty station on the far side of a dead moon. But the beacon had to be built, and wired, and powered, and the power routing to feed it did not exist. It would have to be run by hand, through conduits designed for a fraction of the load, and the conduits would have to be reinforced against a current they were never built to carry. And it would all have to be done in 17 hours by a faculty that had never in its life built anything under pressure, and it would have to be led by someone who did not come apart when the ground moved. "I'll design it," Ren said. "You'll build it. All of you, there's no one to spare, everyone works. I'll tell each of you exactly what to do, and you'll do it exactly, and you won't improvise, and you won't panic, and when you're afraid you'll keep working through the fear, because the fear doesn't stop the work, and the work is the only thing that saves you. That's the whole discipline. That's everything my world taught me, and I'm going to teach it to you in 17 hours because we don't have time for anything slower." She looked out at them, at Ves Andriel in the front row with his bruised shoulder and his frightened honest face, at Provost Soar standing grave and gray at the side, at the whole gentle, unbroken academy about to be tested for the first time in 1,000 years. "You can do this. You think you can't because you never have, but I've watched you for 3 weeks. You're not weak, you're just untested, and I'm going to test you and you're going to pass because the only other option is dying, and I refuse to let a place this beautiful die on my watch. Now, who here knows the power grid?" They worked. They worked for 17 hours, And Ren was everywhere in all of it, throttled up now to her full Deathworld self, because there was no longer any reason to hide it, and every reason not to, moving through the conduits at a speed that left the faculty breathless, hauling reinforcement beams that took 4 of them to lift, and that she carried alone, wiring the decoy beacon with hands that did not shake, going without rest, without food, without any of the softness the Academy had prepared for her. Because Tarsai's IV had trained her for exactly this, and the training did not care that she was tired. She led them the way her father had led, without warmth, without comfort, with nothing but the flat, hard certainty that the work would save them if they did it right. And the gentle people of the Bright Verge, who had never once in their lives been led like that, found, to their own astonishment, that they could follow, that they wanted to follow. That there was something in being told, plainly, by someone who was not afraid, exactly what to do to survive, that steadied them more than all the gentle reassurance of their whole soft lives. Ves Andriel worked beside her for the last 6 hours, on the power routing, and somewhere in those 6 hours, the last of his condescension burned away and left behind something that would, in time, become the finest thing about him. "I called your world rustic," he said once without stopping his work, his voice quiet. "I called it quaint. I'm sorry, I didn't know. I didn't know there were places like that or people like you, or I didn't know anything." Ren, not stopping her work either, said only, "You know now, that's what it's for. That's what all of this is for." And Ves understood that she meant not the beacon but everything. His whole gentle life, the whole gentle sector, and the girl who had been sent into the middle of it to be the one who knew. The swarm arrived in the 18th hour. They watched it come on the station display, a slow, vast river of silica shells filling the dark, and the great central reactor went dark on Ren's command, and every dome on the moon fell into cold and shadow and held its breath. And on the far side of the world, the decoy beacon on the old monitoring station screamed into the black with all the power 17 hours of desperate human-led work could root to it. And the swarm, mindless, starving, drawn always and only to the brightest light, turned. It turned away from the domes full of living souls, and it flowed toward the empty, screaming station on the far side of the dead moon. And it fell upon the beacon and stripped it and consumed it and found no living thing there at all, only metal and light. And when the metal and light were gone, the swarm moved on, into the deep dark, on the long, slow cycle that would not bring it back for another 1,000 years. And it never once knew that a whole civilization had been holding its breath in the cold a few 100 kilometers away, saved by an empty light and a girl who knew what to do when the ground moved. The domes came back to life slowly, the reactor rekindled. Warmth returned to the corridors, and the permanent, gentle dawn crept back over the Null Garden, and the Bright Verge, which had never been tested in 1,000 years, discovered that it had been tested at last, and had passed, and would never again be quite so innocent, and was, though it grieved a little for the innocence, better for the loss. They found Ren in the monitoring station, sitting on the floor with her back to the strongest wall, exactly as she had sat on her first night, watching the swarm recede into the dark on the display. She was not celebrating. She had never once in her life celebrated survival, because on Tarsai's IV survival was not an occasion. It was Tuesday. She was simply watching and resting in the specific total stillness of a body that has spent everything it had and is now methodically refilling. Provost Soar came and sat beside her on the floor, which no provost of the Bright Verge had ever done, and for a while the two of them watched the swarm recede together in silence. "I welcomed you with warm water," the provost said at last, "and a bowl of fruit, and a room with no sharp edges. I thought you were the most fragile guest I had ever received." "I know," said Ren. "It's all right. Everybody thinks that. It's kind of the point of me, actually. Nobody sees it coming. My father says an underestimated thing is a weapon if it's patient and a grave if it's not." She almost smiled. "I've been trying very hard to be patient." "Your father," said Provost Soar, "wrote to me. He said your fortune was about to change and you were the only one on this moon who would know what to do. She looked at the girl beside her, the girl who had crossed 40 meters in 2 seconds and caught the sky and led 200 untested souls through the first catastrophe of their gentle lives. He was right. About all of it. We would have died talking. 200 years of refinement and we would have died in a hall talking, because none of us had ever once had to know what to do. She was quiet a moment. How did you know? At 19. How did you know exactly what to do? Ren watched the last of the swarm vanish into the dark. Because where I'm from, she said, the ground always moves. And the only children who live to my age are the ones who stop being surprised by it. That's all I am. I'm not stronger than you or smarter than you. I'm just not surprised. You spent 1,000 years being safe, and safety made you forget that the universe can turn on you in an afternoon. My world never let me forget it for 11 minutes. That's the whole difference. That's everything. She finally looked at the old provost, and her flat gray eyes for just a moment were not flat at all. My father sent me here because he knew you'd need someone who remembered, not to make you afraid, to make you ready. There's a difference, and I think you understand it now. Provost Soar understood it now. The whole Bright Verge understood it now. And in the years that followed, the gentlest academy in the sector would quietly become something it had never been. A place that remembered the dark existed, that tested itself against it, that trained its beautiful, refined students to keep working through fear, because the fear does not stop the work, and the work is the only thing that saves you. They would build a new curriculum around it. They would call the required first-year course without irony, without quaintness, simply and permanently when the ground moves. And they would remember, every year, in the telling of it, the girl who had walked through their airlock expecting warm water and a padded room, the delicate exchange student they had built a nursery for, who had turned out to be a deathworld warrior forged for exactly the day their fortune changed, and who had spent everything she was, without warmth and without hesitation, to make sure the day did not become their last. Ren stayed the full year. She checked every structure on the moon and re-anchored the ones that trusted the ground too much, and taught the discipline that had no name until she gave it one. And when the year was over, she picked up her single bag, which was still not large, and carried it one-handed and unbothered back through the airlock she had come in by. Ves Andriel came to see her off, and so did the old structural engineer, and so did small, anxious B-Pit, and so did Provost Soar, who had learned, at last, the true shape of the universe from a girl a third her age. You are not alone here, the provost said at the airlock, and it was the phrase B-Pit had recited on the first night, but this time it was true, and this time it was not offered as a comfort to the fragile. It was offered as a fact to the strong from people who had finally learned the difference. You are one of us now. Whatever happens to us, wherever the ground moves next, you are one of us. Come back. Ren Adisa Okonkwo Vance, 19 years old, born on a world that killed the unready, forged into the person who knew what to do when everyone else came apart, looked at the gentle people who had underestimated her and feared her, and finally, at the last, come to hold her in something very close to awe, and she inclined her head, once, the way her father inclined his, and she gave them the only promise a Tarsis-born ever gives, which is the truest promise there is. When the ground moves, she said, I'll come. And the airlock cycled, and she was gone, and the Bright Verge stood a little less innocent and a great deal stronger in the permanent gentle dawn, no longer merely fortunate, but at last, and forever after, ready.